forms inbound. Emperor help us. There's thousands. They're coming over the ridge. We can't hold them! They're crawling up the hole! They're in the tanks! They don't stop! They don't die! Ah!
From the blackness beyond the borders of our galaxy, an organism of boundless hunger stirred. And from this void, it came. An unfathomably ancient intelligence, of one mind and infinite form. The Hive Mind, the Great Devourer. The Tyranid menace is the singular largest threat, not just to the Imperium of man, but to the galaxy itself and beyond. The Eater of Worlds does not rest, its tendrils ever spread between the stars. Planet after planet is drained to the last molecule, until it is nothing more than a barren rock. All organic matter, even microbial, is broken down and absorbed into massive digestion pools and reduced to raw biomass. This biomass is then used to birth new Tyranid organisms for the next invasion. Nothing is wasted, not even their own dead. Every microbe of life becomes fuel for their next feast. 1 billion times 1 billion Tyranids live beyond the outer rim of our galaxy, and each is nothing more than a singular cell of the Hive Mind's vast, ever-multiplying body. Each of these cells, these Xenos creatures, is the pinnacle of evolution and adaptability. A species bred for surviving any and every environment, even the vacuum of space. Bred as living weapons and ravenous maws to feed the insatiable hunger that looms within the synaptic network of uncountable trillions. A hunger not of desire, but of divine inevitability. To that end, the Tyranids are living, breathing weapons. Every part of their biology is built for the purpose of destruction and consumption. From tooth and claw to organic ranged weaponry and spore-spewing gas bladders. Heavy carapaces of chitinous armor to sacks of corrosive bioacid. Tyranids are the undisputed champions of organic technology. Should an army repel the first wave of a Tyranid assault, the second will have made adaptations to its physiology to completely counter any advantages held by the defenders. Conventional war tactics and strategy become meaningless in the face of an enemy that learns and adapts biologically between waves. The Great Devourer seeks not a single planet at a time and deploys not a singular army, but fights and consumes on myriad fronts. Each tendril covering vast swaths of space and blotting out everything in their paths. These horrific threats are the Hive Fleets, and even they are not singular in purpose. Each spreads its own tendrils across the stars. Composed of gargantuan, living, and void-faring ships, each Hive Fleet varies almost infinitely in form and size. Upon their eventual discovery by the Imperium, each known Hive Fleet would be named and tracked in attempts to codify the tyrannic threat, and perhaps in doing so, utterly diminishing the terrifying truth. The galaxy and the Imperium's first encounter with the Great Devourer would come from a Hive Fleet given the code name Behemoth. Its arrival shattered all that mankind believed about its dominion over the stars, and altered the course of history forever. The threat and scale of the destruction wrought upon the galaxy by the Tyrannic Wars to come would be absolute. For in the face of an insatiable, unknowable god, there is no parley, no ambition, no ideology, only hunger. From the Eastern Fringe, Behemoth came, a quadrillion fangs lining billions of maws, each opened wide to the galaxy, as if they meant to swallow the Milky Way whole. In this far eastern swath of space, on the outskirts of the Imperium, was the ocean world known as Tyran. For the preceding decade, the Mechanicus outpost on Tyran had been sending many ambiguous reports to the Imperium. That had anyone encountered the Great Devourer before, would have long known of the doom encroaching upon the planet, like a starving shadow blotting out the stars. Recent explorer scans showed entire planets, once logged as life-supporting, now barren and lifeless. This was dismissed, as earlier surveys were known to have been hundreds, sometimes even thousands of years old. But as time continued, the techno-magi on Tyran Primus would discover other worlds that were known to have thriving ecosystems had in turn become barren rock. Even then, with no identifiable cause to the phenomenon, these reports were also paid little attention to. These planets were not home to any sentient life, and were still thousands of light years from the nearest Imperium-controlled planet. A mystery of the unknowable and infinitely expanding universe was all it would be chalked up to be. The outpost on Tyran would nonetheless continue to dutifully file reports of the dead worlds that continued to pile up. This would eventually attract the proper attention, that of the mystery-abhorring Inquisition, but not before it was far too late. In early 745 M41, Behemoth descended upon the doomed Tyran Primus. The first warning came from a damaged survey ship returning to the Tyran outpost with dire tidings of that which loomed on the edge of the Tyran system. Whatever this threat was, it was coming, and days later, the Xenos swarm arrived. But Tyran's outpost would not prove easy prey. It was built deep within a chain of ancient volcanic islands, and thus fortified to endure the fiercest of Tyran's storms, as well as the aggressive sea creatures. But their defenses didn't end there. On the edge of Imperial space and secluded from other worlds, it was equipped with armaments that the very mention of would deter piratical space raiders and any aggressive Xenos presence. Unfortunately for them, however, the Tyranids were not just any Xenos presence. As Behemoth made its appearance, the outpost's orbital defenses opened fire. 4 giant defense lasers towered over the outpost, complemented by 36 autocannons and las cannon emplacements, which overlapped a network of defensive bastions and Proteus-class bunkers. Within the outpost was its commander, Magos Varnak, and his Skitarii Guard, 3 full wings of Thunderbolt fighters, 3 Endeavor-class battlecruisers, and an entire infantry regiment of the Imperial Guard. This was all the Imperium standard for those who guarded the frontier worlds, a force design that had already been proven against 100 adversaries. The Tyranids would reduce it to rubble within hours. For the first hour, the skies of Tyran were torn asunder, as the orbital defenses incessantly fired round after desperate round, until even the laser towers glowed bright white, threatening to overheat and melt completely in on themselves. It was then that the Tyranids seemingly withdrew in retreat. Bolstered by this false confidence, Magos Varnak immediately deployed his small fleet to finish off the would-be invaders. This would be a fatal mistake. After penetrating the spore cloud that masked Behemoth's fleet, the battlecruisers discovered that the hour-long orbital bombardment had destroyed fewer than a dozen of the Tyranid vessels. Fewer than a dozen in a fleet amassed of several thousand. The Tyranid bioships tore Varnak's fleet apart, and with the Imperium cruisers destroyed, they descended once again. And this time, Tyran's defenses could not hold the swarm at bay. Thousands of mycetic spores rained down on the world. The oceans boiled and thrashed as the Xenos burst forth from their pods, tearing away at Tyran's sea life. Then the Xenos began to scale the walls of the Imperium outpost, its 4 defensive lasers still firing at all directions. Disciplined volleys of Imperial Guard fire drove the climbing creatures back, for a time. But wave after wave of Hormagaunts and Gene Stealers tore themselves from the sea and clambered up the walls, sending the defenders reeling in retreat. And one by one, the laser towers fell silent, their barrels clogged by mindless gargoyles, or their towers shattered by rampaging carnifexes. Hope was gone. An hour after Hive Fleet Behemoth made landfall upon Tyran, the outpost was as good as lost, down to the last remaining souls on the planet. Even the remaining guardsmen from the death world of Catacan, recognized as among the toughest and most stalwart in the Imperium, had fled from their posts, desperately searching for an escape that would never exist. Soon, only the command bunker remained. Within, Magos Varnak saw through the last functioning displays the Tyranid take out the last of his Skitarii in the next room over. Hormagaunts hurled themselves against the command center doors, shrieking and clawing with a ravenous fury. The adamantine seal groaned. It would not hold. Tyranids soon poured into the command center. Magos Varnak said a silent prayer to the Omnissiah and triggered a switch, sending a data codex plummeting into the depths of Tyran. This codex would be the enduring legacy of Tyran, to be found by the Inquisition many months later. On it would contain all the information gathered on the invading Xenos during the hours of Tyran's complete destruction, as well as Magos Varnak's very last words.
We cannot live through this. Mankind cannot live through this. In a single day, they have covered this planet with a flood of living blades and needle-fanged mouths. Kill 1 and 10 take its place. If they are truly without number, then our race is doomed to a violent death, before every shred of our civilization is scoured away by a force more voracious than the fires of hell themselves. Death. By the machine god, death is here.
The myriad reports filed to the Explorator General from Tyran on the unusual occurrence of barren worlds sprouting up had done little more than collect dust in the hundreds of miles of data cores forming the Administratum's archives on Terra. Tyran would continue to do so for the years leading up to its destruction. The reports would, however, eventually catch the eye of Inquisitor Fidus Kryptman of the Ordo Xenos. He began to ask questions about the state of things near the Eastern Fringe, and when the Explorator's office offered little information, he decided to compile and analyze all of Tyran's findings himself. Upon doing so, a terrifying fact became readily apparent. While the nature of the phenomena of worlds going extinct was unclear, what was clear was that there was a distinct pattern unfolding, and that it was encroaching deep into the galactic rim, heading directly towards Tyran. Upon presenting these findings to a conclave of his fellow Inquisitors, he was given dispensation to command a ship and travel to the Eastern Fringe to investigate these occurrences further. By the time Kryptman reached Tyran, it had been a year since the attack, and he could not equate the barren rock of a planet he was seeing to the vast ocean-bound Tyran. After a thorough investigation and many scans of the planet, Kryptman unearthed the data codex Magos Varnak had sent into the planet's crust. Grimly, Kryptman and his aides watched the footage of Tyran's final hours and learned the full horror of this new alien threat to the Imperium. first contact had been made, and if not for Varnak, the information gathered on this threat would have come at a far worse time. In honor of Tyran, Inquisitor Kryptman named this new Xenos threat the Tyranids. As Kryptman continued watching the footage from Tyran, a burning question aided him. Why hadn't Tyran's astropath broadcast any messages to any part of the Imperium? Kryptman's own astropath, pale at the implications, told him that even now there were still disruptions in the warp that were left behind by the Tyranids' arrival, which would have made astro-telepathy impossible. This phenomena would soon be known as the shadow in the warp, a suffocating psychic silence that heralded the Tyranids' arrival. The data codex was the only way Magos Varnak found to preserve the information of what happened to Tyran, and the cost was the life of an entire planet. The footage cut off with Tyranids breaching the command center and Varnak's last words. Kryptman immediately ordered his astropath to project a vision of everything they'd seen back to the Imperium. But the Psyker was unable to pierce the turmoiled warp the Tyranids had left behind. Not even the nearby Thandros Adeptus Telepathica relay matrix was unobscured. In a desperate bid, Kryptman set course for Thandros, hoping to re-establish communications there. But upon arrival in the sector, Kryptman and his crew would find an entire sector of barren rocks, empty and hollow, a vast swath of more nothing in the infinite expanse of nothing. The planets here and their people fought and died alone, horrified and secluded. Reviewing a decade's worth of planetary survey data from the Thandros region, Kryptman saw the pattern emerging even further. He was further able to see the course the Hive Fleet had set upon, leaving a trail of dead worlds in its wake. There was no subtlety to their approach, no strategy, no cunning, just hunger incarnate. It simply plowed its way through the galaxy, unhindered, consuming all before it. It was then, as decreed by Imperium tradition, that the Hive Fleet was codified with the ancient and forbidding name of legend, Behemoth. But Thandros was still completely and utterly lost, and the data indicated that the Ultramar system was where the Tyranids would strike next. Kryptman's quest had quickly become more critical than ever. Unless Ultramar was forewarned, the Imperium may miss its best opportunity to halt the encroaching swarm in the face of the Emperor's Angels of Death. Kryptman and his men quickly salvaged what remained of Thandros' Telepathica matrix. And through nothing short of a Herculean effort, Kryptman's astropath pierced the shadow in the warp to relay all they had learned of the Tyranids to the unawares Imperium. The astropath, on the verge of collapse, blood streaming from every orifice on his face, received only a single reply from the depths of the warp. That voice came from Macragge, the very heart of Ultramar, and the home world of the ultramarines themselves. By the Emperor's benevolent grace, Inquisitor Kryptman arrived at Macragge just ahead of the advancing behemoth. There, beneath the portico of his white marbled palace, Kryptman met with Chapter Master Marneus Calgar, the pride of Ultramar and cradle of Guilliman's legacy. Calgar listened intently to the Inquisitor's reports, not once losing his noble demeanor, despite the many horrific revelations Kryptman relayed. No, Marneus Calgar was the truest heir of Guilliman's genius, and was one of the most decorated military leaders in the entire Imperium. But Hive Fleet Behemoth was coming to the very heart of the Ultramarine Empire, and so Lord Calgar and the entire Ultramarines chapter prepared for the greatest battle of their history, the greatest trial they would face since the days of the Horus Heresy. It is important to note that Behemoth wasn't only targeting worlds of the Imperium. It was incredibly unbiased in who or what it devoured. The Eldar craft world Malantai was warned of Behemoth's approach even before the fall of Tyrann, by outflung bands of rangers and pathfinders who sensed the encroaching shadow in the warp. The Farseers of Malantai decided to flee from Behemoth's path and leave the younger races of the galaxy to fend for themselves. While en route to Macragge, the tendrils of Behemoth were also visited upon the Necron tomb world of Solemnance and the Orc world of Jaga. The minor tendrils that discovered Solemnance were unable to find any other nutrient-rich worlds in its vicinity, and thus, and likely rightly so, deemed that a prolonged conflict with the Necrons here would result in only a net loss of biomass. These two tendrils instead lapsed into hibernation. The Orc world Jaga would not be as fortunate. Jaga was home to the pirate base of Captain Blackgit, and when Behemoth appeared over the planet, Captain Blackgit rallied his fleet of Orc cruisers and took the fight straight to Behemoth. Blackgit's troops launched boarding parties into the storm of Behemoth's bioships. While initially successful in their approach, the rampaging Orcs would soon awaken the Turvagons slumbering in each of the ships they boarded. Turvagons, beyond being just large and powerful synapse beasts, are known for being broodmothers, capable of spawning countless broods of termagants from their bulging abdomens. The awoken Turvagons did just that. The Orc boarding parties weren't just driven back to their ships through the boarding tubes, they were followed back by the masses of termagants, which would go on to slaughter every Orc aboard the cruisers. Captain Blackgit, seeing defeat at hand, attempted to flee the battle and the Hive Fleet by ramming his cruiser through the lone bioship blocking his path. Unfortunately for Captain Blackgit, and despite the Orcs giving the Tyranids their fiercest battle yet, this was not in fact a bioship, but rather a ship-sized spore mine. Behemoth even tangled with a Chaos Renegade warband that was in the process of preparing to strike at Ultramar themselves. On the fortress world of Sibari, the Chaos Warband known as the Death Shadows becomes isolated when the shadow in the warp envelops the system. Their warlord, a sorcerer named Malefor, is driven to insanity by the psychic blanket. Now caught off guard, in the midst of planning a completely different war, and now leaderless, the Death Shadows are completely unprepared to defend themselves against the Maw of Behemoth. Despite reaping a high tally of deaths in their favor, the entirety of the Renegade Warband is devoured in less than an hour. Many worlds and moons of Ultramar fell as Behemoth approached ever closer to Macragge, including the garden world of Prandium, once known as the jewel in Ultramar's crown. The Tyranids left its paradise a barren ruin. When finally arriving at the ultramarine homeworld, the Hive Fleet did so at full strength, unaware that they would also be coming face to face with the prepared full might of the Sons of Guilliman. A month had gone by since Inquisitor Kryptman had arrived and informed Chapter Master Calgar of the dire new Tyranid threat. The Ultramarines had wasted no time in preparing for nothing short of all-out war. Dozens of ships hung in orbit around the planet, not including the many Titanic-sized Space Marine battle barges, and still more ships had been arriving every day. Combined with the planet's own orbital weapons platforms, Macragge was now encircled by a ring of firepower. Any other foe would have hesitated, if not completely fled at the battle-readied sight of Macragge. But the Tyranids knew neither fear nor caution, and when they arrived at Macragge, they came at the Ultramarines like a living flood. ravenous hunger versus zealous will. Hive Fleet against Astartes' world. The hive mind swarms contra the Emperor's angels of death. Two juggernauts of devastating and absolute killing power stood nose to nose. The battle for Macragge began in earnest. The Tyranid onslaught began in mass and without delay. Waves of bioships threw themselves against the ultramarines' fleet, and each was eliminated by the might of Imperium firepower. But with every wave Behemoth launched, they breached ever further into the atmosphere, little by little, delivering clusters of bioorganisms to the planet's surface. Before long, and despite the fleet and orbital defense's massed firepower, many thousands of Tyranid life forms had made planetfall and began swarming over the surface. Chapter Master Calgar knew that the ground battle against the Tyranids wouldn't be singular. Their numbers were far too vast. So he divided his army into 3 parts. 2 of these task forces, composed primarily of First Company veterans, were sent to defend Macragge's vital polar fortresses. For if they were to fall, the orbital cannons keeping the much larger Tyranid force at bay would go silent, and the planet would then be surely doomed. The third and largest of forces was led by Calgar himself, and were tasked with slowing down the ground invasion heading for the polar fortresses. Initially, the ultramarines were successful with this tactic, but the Tyranid tide is ever flowing and ever adapting. Despite the military genius of Marneus Calgar, the sheer numbers of Behemoth could not be outwitted, and the ultramarines were forced to make a final stand at Cold Steel Ridge. The hive mind, having been learning the tactics of the ultramarines, identified Calgar as the main threat to the Tyranid advance, and in response, unleashed its deadliest servant to end the chapter master. The Hive Tyrant, later classified in Imperial records as the Swarm Lord, descended upon Macragge and took control of the Tyranid attack. The influence of the Swarm Lord brought with it a mind of keen strategy to pair with the primal fury of the Tyranids. Now, instead of mindlessly throwing themselves at their enemy, the swarm circumvented fire zones and set ambushes upon enemy counterattacks, and even concentrated on the weak points in the Ultramarines' lines that could only have been perceived by a mind of pure tactical and military genius. And soon, the sons of Guilliman were in danger of being overwhelmed. With the Ultramarines on their heels, the Swarm Lord extended its synaptic will even further, and 10,000 Xenos minds answered the call. Raveners and Trigons burst from beneath the earth in the midst of manned trenches, separating the exhausted defenders from the main force and Calgar. The Ultramarines responded by purging the Xenos with fire, but not before a wave of Carnifexes tore through their mighty Baneblade tank, whose cannon fire was critical to holding that flank. And with its destruction, the western flank was indeed lost. On the eastern flank, Calgar realized that he had been underestimating his foe, and cursed himself for doing so. The swarm was adapting rapidly to his tactics, as quickly as he could conceive of them. Finally, knowing that staying on Cold Steel Ridge would bring nothing but more death to his men, Calgar ordered the Ultramarines to retreat to the orbiting battle barge Octavius. All they would need to do was hold out for a bit longer, for the Thunderhawks to arrive for extraction. But the Swarm Lord was somehow able to sense Calgar's intent to retreat, and finally threw itself into the fray with a deafening alien shriek. Alongside the Swarm Lord came a host of elite warrior organisms, and they carved a path through the Ultramarines to their prey. Upon seeing this threat to their chapter master, more Ultramarines hastened their efforts towards his aid, but would instead find themselves surrounded by Tyranid swarms directed to intercept them. And allay them it did. Calgar would have to face the Hive Tyrant and its bodyguards alone. The favored son of Guilliman fought against the Xenos Tyrant and his minions like a hero of legend. But in the end, as is the case with most Tyranid attacks, there were simply too many. The last of Calgar's strength was spent in the mortal clash with the Swarm Lord itself, his body rent and torn. As the Hive Tyrant loomed over him, blade raised to strike the killing blow, Calgar's honor guard finally broke through the Tyranid mass, throwing themselves, body and soul, into the Swarm Lord's blades to shield their master. Their valor and sacrifice would prove to be enough. The Thunderhawks had arrived. Marneus Calgar and the remaining ultramarines would not die at the now lost Cold Steel Ridge. Despite how poorly the ground war was faring for the ultramarines, the war in space was far worse. The first Tyranid assault wave saw the destruction of the mighty battle barge Caesar. The third decimated Ultramar's fleet. By the ninth, Macragge's orbital stations drifted in space as crimson tombs. Macragge was defenseless, and the Hive Fleet's invasion was only intensifying. Fresh waves of Tyranid forces had landed upon the world's polar fortresses, but the war in space still wasn't quite at its conclusion. Though his body was barely holding together, Calgar refused more than the most essential medical attention. With fire still in his veins, he took command of what remained of the fleet, ordering them to focus their firepower on the orbiting Hive Fleet. Just as it had done above Tyran Primus, Behemoth retreated its biovessels from the planet to lure their prey into a deadly trap. Calgar, however, was not as easily fooled as Magos Varnak had been, and took the Tyranids' bait with a plan of his own. He pursued the Hive Fleet to the ringed world of Circe at the edge of the Macragge system. As he approached, a second swarm of bioships revealed themselves from within the planet's rings, launching themselves at Calgar's battered fleet. Just as the salvos began being exchanged between the two fleets, the fabric of reality rippled and tore behind them. From the warp emerged a colossal fleet of Imperial Navy ships known as Battlefleet Baka. And now it was Behemoth's turn to writhe in the jaws of a well-set trap. Even still, the fighting was fierce, and the battle wouldn't turn in the Imperium's favor until the sacrifice of the Dominus Astra. This grand Emperor-class battleship detonated its enormous warp engines in the midst of the Tyranid fleet, creating a cataclysmic vortex which dragged many of the bioships into oblivion. Now, vastly outnumbered and caught in between the rampacious guns of two Imperial fleets, Hive Fleet Behemoth was torn apart. A scant few of the bioships managed to slip away into the expanse of space, but nearly all of them had still been destroyed. The Behemoth had been shattered. The Imperium stood victorious as the First Tyrannic War came to a glorious end at Circe. The only question on Calgar's mind, however, was whether or not Macragge had been lost in the process. Even while Calgar led the offensive in space, the valor of the Ultramarines remaining on Macragge would be nothing short of legendary. The veterans of the First Company led the grueling defense of the polar fortresses, holding every single wall and battlement. Never once did they yield in the face of the seemingly infinite enemy. When their bolters fired no more, they fought with pistols. When those ran dry, they fought with chainswords and blades. Only at the last possible moment would they fall back into the heart of the fortresses, fully prepared to give their lives. When Calgar and the fleet-bound ultramarines returned to Macragge, they saw nothing but a landscape ruined by carnage around the polar fortresses. Very few survivors were found amidst the chaos in the south, but in the north, where the swarm lord itself had led the assault, there was no life to be found. The first company died to a man there, fighting side by side, back to back, against the fullest fury of the Tyranid swarm. And through death they had found victory. Though they had prevailed over the Hive Fleet on both land and space, the cost would see the sons of Guilliman bleed for centuries to come, with the need to rebuild their most veteran force, as the first company had been completely annihilated. Chapter Master Calgar gave this task to Chaplain Orton Cassius, whose hate for the Tyranids knew no bounds. Cassius petitioned Calgar to create a new fighting force of ultramarines known as Tyrannic War Veterans, composed only of those who had survived the fight against Hive Fleet Behemoth, knowing that those who did would know the true scope and threat of the Tyranids, and knew no one would be safe until they were eradicated entirely. But of course, such a force within the ultramarines, the staunchest followers of the Codex Astartes, would indeed be both unorthodox for them and non-compliant. The arguments for both creating and not creating this regiment would be many. In order to settle this conundrum, Calgar held the great conclave of Hera to follow the Feast of Remembrance, where the chapter honors all those who were lost to Behemoth. Calgar allowed every warrior present to speak, and delayed the conclave's start until representatives from as many chapters as possible had arrived. This conclave would last for many months, until at last Calgar had heard all he needed to hear, announcing that he would retire to his chambers and ponder on the issue. 40 more days passed, and on that 40th dawn, Calgar emerged just as word had reached Macragge that Tyranid creatures were attacking settlements on the world of Espendor, Xenos threats that had been stranded in the realm of Ultramar. Calgar took this as a sign from the Emperor himself, and declared that the Tyrannic War Veterans would become part of the Ultramarines' military structure, and this would be their first trial. With Hive Fleet Behemoth shattered and devastated, it was all but lost. Small splinters had scattered from Macragge and Circe, drifting off into the blackness of space to hide and to hibernate, and even to continue their search for biomass, awaiting the day in which Behemoth would be resurrected in full.
There is a cancer eating at the Imperium. With each decade, it advances deeper, leaving drained, dead worlds in its wake. This horror, this abomination, has thought and purpose, which functions on an unimaginable galactic scale. And all we can do is try to stop the swarms of bioengineered monsters it unleashes upon us by instinct. We have given the horror a name to salve our fears. We call it the Tyranid race. But if it is aware of us at all, it must know us only as prey.